Welcome to the 12th session of the Trade Policy Dialogue. My name is Miho Shirotori, and I'll be your moderator for today's session. The Regional Integration and Trade Division of the Economic Commission for Africa and the Division on International Trade and Commodities of UNCTAD join hands today to facilitate the debate on trade preferences. The topic of trade preferences is both old and contemporary. It was over 50 years ago, in 1971 to be exact, that the Generalized System of Preferences, or GSP, came to life under the aegis of UNCTAD. It has provided tariff rates that were lower than the MFN rates for exports of selected developing countries without the need to open their markets to the GSP granting trade partners. And Africa has been at the center of the evolving preferential trade landscape since the time of the Lome Conventions in the 1970s. But trade preference is also a contemporary issue, especially as the world braces for US tariffs and possible retaliation from its trade partners. We all know that high tariffs will enhance the value of preferences. But will this strategy be sustainable for long-term trade-led development? Dear participants, today's session is organized as follows. After opening remarks, UNCTAD will present the key findings and highlights the key messages from its Trade Preferences Outlook 2024 to set the scene for the discussion today. We then invite the distinguished panelists to share their insights on the questions we have previously posed to them. And dear participants, during the session, you can pose your questions anytime using the Q&A box as you see at the bottom. And we want to address as many questions as possible during the webinar. Now, let me invite Mr. Melaku Desta, the coordinator of the African Trade Policy Center at the Regional Integration and Trade Division of the ECA, to make his opening remarks. Melaku, please take the floor.
Miho, thank you very much. I see Madam Director, Ms. Maria de la Mora, Director of the Division on International Trade and Commodities at the United Nations Trade and Development. It's always easy to call UN Trade and Development by its old name, Conference on Trade and Development, no longer a conference. Invited guests and representatives of the different international and regional organizations, as well as academic institutions. Ladies and gentlemen, on behalf of the ECA, the Economic Commission for Africa, and particularly on behalf of my director, Stephen Karengi, the director of the Regional Integration and Trade Division, I would like to welcome you to this dialogue on trade preferences Outlook 2024 towards new market access cooperation. We are having this discussion, colleagues, at a critical time, when multilateralism in general and the multilateral trading system in particular are facing unprecedented challenges. The rules and institutions governing international trade relations are under attack from different sources. The fundamental principles of transparency, predictability, and non-discrimination that underpin the rules-based system are being supplanted by power-based economic diplomacy and cycles of tit-for-tat protectionism. The multilateral trading system has long been accused of undermining the development aspirations of the poorest members of the international community. Earlier efforts to inject development into its work program have been often very half-hearted, and the resulting decisions, provisions have been lacking in enforceable legal content. The most recent attempt to put development at the heart of the Doha negotiations has come to nothing. Since its establishment 6 decades ago, UNCTAD has been at the forefront of the struggle to harness the power of trade for development. The report on non-reciprocal trade preferences that we are considering today is only the latest in the series of bold, penetrating, and thought-provoking analysis and reports that we are used to getting from this important institution. This report asks the critical question of whether or to what extent non-reciprocal trade preferences still hold value for the supposed beneficiaries. Following a rigorous examination of the data over time, the report concludes that the non-reciprocal trade preferences are no longer as effective as they could be, identifies the reasons behind their diminished effectiveness, and proposes a host of practical ways by which this can be mitigated. Seen from the perspective of Africa, non-reciprocal trade preferences certainly have their place. However, just like the report finds, their effectiveness is being eroded by a number of factors. Their relationship with Africa's own internal integration program being perhaps the most important challenge. Today, we will have an opportunity to discuss some of these issues in some depth with leading experts on the subject. Allow me to conclude by expressing my thanks to UNCTAD for this excellent and highly timely report and for their invitation to co-host this dialogue. I wish all of us fruitful conversations. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Melaku. Now I'd like to invite the director of the UNCTAD Division on International Trade and Commodities, Ms. Luzma de la Mora, to deliver her opening remarks. Luzma, please take the floor.
Thank you, Mijo. Good afternoon, everyone. I'm very happy to be able to participate in the welcoming remarks of this event. Let me extend my warmest welcome to all of you who are with us in this seminar today. I also want to start by thanking Mr. Melaku Desta at the Economic Commission for Africa for partnering with us in co-hosting this trade policy dialogue. We are really delighted to be able to join forces as two sister organizations promoting trade policy for development. It is always a great pleasure working with the ECA as we collaborate regularly, and our cooperation has always been excellent. Let me start by telling you a little bit of history. UNCTAD was established in 1964 to be the focal point within the UN system for the integrated treatment of trade and development. Throughout its more than 60 years already, UNCTAD's mission has been to foster developing countries' gainful participation in international trade. It is under this overarching goal that UNCTAD adopted Resolution 21 in 1968, paving the way to the emergence of the Generalized System of Preferences, which we all know by its acronym, the GSP. This is why the topic of our session today, trade preferences, is so dear to our heart. The establishment of GSP was a significant milestone in the history of UNCTAD and that of international development cooperation more generally, as it allowed unilateral opening of markets in favor of the exports of developing countries, of course, with the idea that trade could promote development. Indeed, the GSP, or the Generalized System of Preferences, and non-reciprocal trade preferences has supported North-South trade flows for over more than 5 decades. ECA members are no exceptions. Actually, many economies in the region have greatly benefited from access, for example, to EU markets under ACP preferences, such as under the Lomé Conventions. The EU's Everything But Arms initiative, also known as EBA, under EU GSP, has eliminated tariffs and quotas for LDC's exports, while the African Growth and Opportunity Act, or also known as AGOA, of the United States of America, has facilitated exports of sub-Saharan African countries. So these are only a few examples of how the GSP has been implemented. These preferential trade opportunities, unilateral and non-reciprocal, have supported the export expansion, for example, in labor-intensive manufacturing sectors, such as, for example, apparel, and this has also resulted in the creation of well-paid jobs. Let me offer you a few numbers. In sub-Saharan Africa, in 2021, an estimated between 240,000 to 290,000 jobs were created only in the apparel sectors of the 8 largest AGOA beneficiary countries. And let me offer you an additional figure and fact. These jobs were mainly represented by women. These were jobs created for women. These jobs, women represented between 70 and 90% of the workforce. And apparel jobs were also relatively well paid, and more importantly, they acted as an entry point to the formal economy, which is not minor. However, it is also time for us to ask how effective these trade preferences have been in stimulating developing country exports, and more importantly, what can we do better to maximize the impact of these kinds of regimes on sustainable development, including through out-of-the-box policy innovation. These are some of the questions that we here at UNCTAD have tried to address in a recent report called Trade Preferences Outlook 2024 that we will discuss with you today. In the report, we see that the trade stimulating impact of tariff preferences is on a declining trend for several reasons, including preference erosion. That is to say, the rise of non-tariff measures and the expansion of global value chains. Let me give you an example of what we mean by tariff erosion. The global average MFN and applied rates have fallen to about 1/3 of the levels that they had in the 1990s. And this is explained by the multilateral tariff reductions that has taken place or that have taken place under WTO, and also as a result of the proliferation of free trade agreements that have reduced the potential space for this tariff preference margin. While LDCs may benefit from preferential duty-free treatment, those preferential rates may not offer a significant price advantage over other direct competitors, which are often other developing countries receiving similar preferential treatment. For example, in 16 developed markets, the average effective preference margin between applied rates for LDCs and other developing countries is only of 1.3 percentage points, which at the end is really marginal. In the meantime, the cost of non-tariff measures, that is to say regulations that apply to products that have to come into a market, has become more significant when we compare them with tariffs. So NTMs have adversely affected small exporters and LDCs. And let me also offer you a number. Estimates suggest that the ad valorem equivalent costs of NTMs amount to less than 1% in developed countries, but they increased to almost 4% in Africa due to lack of infrastructure for product certification, just to give you one example. Finally, the increased use of imported inputs due to the cross-border nature of border production processes makes it more difficult to really identify the origin of goods. So that reduces the use of tariff preferences applied to final products. And this is the result of the dynamics of global value chains where inputs components move across borders several times. So what do we do looking forward? As the sources of today's trade competitiveness are moving away from competitive low labor cost towards more technology and high skills, services, and foreign direct investment, we may have to work out a new market access cooperation scheme beyond only tariffs to bolster developing country exports and to allow developing countries to really reap the benefits of participating in international trade. For example, expanding production in line with trade preferences requires new investments. So directing outward FDI through targeted promotion activities and incentives to preference receiving countries may be instrumental for really maximizing the benefits of preferential trade for the local economies. So I do hope that our discussion today will help us inform and understand better the present and future of trade preferences, and above all, the potential of new market access cooperation beyond tariffs. For example, as Africa deepens its own economic integration under the African Continental Free Trade Area, we see this discussion as really important for a reflection of how best developing countries and countries in Africa may be supported in reaping development gains from trade through a strategy that anchors North-South and South-South trade cooperation. So let me conclude my remarks by thanking once again the Economic Commission for Africa and Mr. Desta for the excellent collaboration. And also I want to thank our speakers for their contributions and my colleagues for organizing this policy dialogue. I wish you a very fruitful discussion today, and I wish you have a good day. Thank you very much. Back to you, Mijo.
Thank you very, very much, Luzma. Dear participants, I now would like to invite UNCTAD team to make a brief presentation of the key findings of the Trade Preferences Outlook 2024 to set the scene for panel discussion. I would like to invite Mr. Mesut Saygele, who is one of the main authors of the report, to introduce the topic. Mesut, you have the floor, please.
Thank you, Mijo. I would like to briefly share my screen to show my presentation here. Okay. Good afternoon, everyone. As a part of my team, I would like to discuss briefly the findings of our recent report. We are very happy that, our publication, Trade Preferences Outlook 2024, is now available, and we are happy to share with the results with you. First of all, I would like to say that it is sorry, yes, it's working. I would like to give the key messages right at the beginning so that we know what we are talking about, what are the main findings. First of all, we have three findings. One thing is that these trade preferences has been influential in part, at least for some developing countries, for them to increase their exports, to diversify, and to develop. But there's always a caution on that this impact is positive but limited. Not everyone benefited the same way. Second point is that these programs actually initiated in the world economy of 1960s, 70s, and it is not the same world we are talking about anymore. That means there's a paradigm shift that we also need to make when we devise these programs. And what do we mean by this paradigm shift is the last point that we have. We would like to discuss whether these tariffs are significant in today's world or not, and what else needs to be done. Our analysis has shown that it has been shrunk over time, and we need actually deeper and wider cooperation to be able to make them more effective. So these are the basic key points that we would like to convey to you. And then I would like to show you our publication. This is the cover page of our publication. We just coming back to the origin of the trade preferences. We have three pillars of these preferences. When we go back to 1960s, it is based on three principles. One is it has to be generalized. That means it has to apply to all developing countries. Non-reciprocal, that means the beneficiary countries do not have to make any concession. They don't have to reduce their tariffs, but only they receive preferential treatment. Non-discriminatory, that means all beneficiary countries will be treated equally. Coming back to its origin, where it came from the when newly independent developing countries are stuck with commodity dependence. So there was a need for diversifying their economies and help their development. Under these conditions, actually, during the 1960s, UNCTAD second conference, during the second conference, there was a decision in 1968 to promote these economies, these newly independent economies, through tariff concessions. So it started with 1971 with the European Economic Community, and it followed with other economies like Canada and Japan, then later Canada, US, etc. In the following years. Today, when we talk about these preferences, we are mainly talking about 16 developed countries who are offering both generalized GSP to developing countries and also the LDC only schemes, and 9 developing countries offering only LDC schemes for the LDCs. And when we look at the over time from 1960s to today, we've seen some major changes as well. I just wanted to just mention 3 of them. One of them was the rules of origin, changes and reforms in rules of origin. Rules of origin actually says where this product is made from. And these programs usually put certain limits where imported inputs, the foreign inputs, how much of them can be used in production. And one of the concerns was that they could be very restrictive, especially for LDCs, where they don't have domestic productive capacities too much to produce all the production stages. So in 2003, in Canada, in 2011, in EU, and also Japan had it much later, they had some reforms. That means made it more flexible in a sense. For example, in the case of apparel, they make it more flexible to moving from double transformation to single transformation. We've seen that really affected the utilization of these programs by the beneficiary countries during that period. So actually rules of origin really reforms had impact on particularly those sectors that developing countries had competitive advantage. Then we talk about excluding some high and upper middle income countries among the beneficiaries. That is kind of a normal development because over time we noticed that developing countries become much richer and much more competitive. So some of them were excluded because they've already developed. So at the end, the program starting from, let's say, 2014 in the EU case, that started focusing more on LDCs and countries in need. Then the more advanced countries like China and India started to be excluded from these programs. And final shift we see is the introduction of the FQF duty-free, quota-free programs. Basically, from 70s to today, developing countries became also the major markets. In 1970s, world imports were only done by developed economies, 80% of them. And today, when we come, it is half and half. So more developing countries started their own programs, especially after the WTO ministerial in Hong Kong in 2005. It started with the major economies like India in 2008 and China in 2010. They also started their LDC-only programs. So these are the major changes we see. Then today, as we already mentioned, our director also mentioned that we are now today in a world questioning whether these preferences are really creating an advantage to beneficiary countries or not. If we look at this upper right-hand corner graph, this shows the MFN rate over time globally and applied rates. We see that both of them are going down. So it was about 20% back then, MFN rate. Now it is less than 9%. So what is driving that development is, of course, the multilateral trade negotiations has lowered the international tariffs, RTAs, proliferation of RTAs, and bilateral trade agreements. What is the consequence of that? That means the margin, even though LDCs or developing countries are getting less tariffs, they're facing less tariffs in these major markets, their preferential margin is not as high as, is not increasing. If you look at the lower panel, you will see that preference margin, that means the tariff that these developing countries, actually this is for the LDCs, vis-a-vis the MFN rate they could have faced are actually flat. That means 5 percentage points. However, what is more relevant indicator is the effective margin we call. That means vis-a-vis their competitor, vis-a-vis the other developing countries. And we see on the right-hand side of that graph that the margin is about 1%, 1.3%, and it is not increasing. So that shows that actually what we can offer through these tariff concessions may come to its limits. It is, of course, contributing as a level playing field for LDCs, but it's not creating competitive advantages anymore. Then what else is actually becoming a cost? Actually, other things, for example, NTMs. As we see on this graph, over time, there was a tenfold increase in non-tariff measures globally. Non-tariff measures are regulations that apply to all producers, importers, imported products included. However, these costs are not neutral in a sense. Some firms, especially the small ones, especially the ones located in LDCs, will feel the cost effect much more because they don't need to also comply with, they also document that they comply with these regulations. And for them, maybe a certain amount of costs may have a higher share of their revenues, higher share of their price of their product than their competitor in a more advanced economies. And also UNCTAD study shows that these costs has been increasing in terms of ad valorem equivalent of tariffs, that is double the tariffs costs. And moreover, it's much more higher in agriculture products because the protections are much higher in agriculture. This is the sector usually very important for LDCs and producers there. And other factors that we can look at beyond NTMs are the changing in the competitiveness or the factors that affect competitiveness of the firms. One of them we already mentioned is global value chains. What do we mean by global value chains is that the production is now today made in multiple locations. Production processes are divided in different phases and different locations are producing different parts. That means the product has to travel multiple times. They can to cross the borders multiple times. That means tariffs are more important. Plus, rules of origin, how to document the rules of origin becomes much more complicated. Another factor which is also important is that usually these global value chains has regional basis. That means they work in certain regions that are connected with each other. So if one country has a benefit is a beneficiary of a program while the neighbor is not, then it becomes very difficult to build or form global value chains with the neighbors. So it kind of can be a hindering factor if there is not a regional focus. And also, it also emphasizes the domestic trade policies of the beneficiaries. Import tariffs will become important for these for these beneficiary countries as well. Another major development is FDIs. Over time, they become much more important, even though recently we see some decline recently. But they are the kind of a driving force for global value chains as well. And it's also very important source for technology learning and skill development. Without it, it's very difficult to acquire those skills, those investments, as well as the technological learning to happen in developing countries. However, the question is, are these beneficiary countries getting more FDI because they are the beneficiary, they are part of the GSP? Another development is the technology and skill intensity of production has been increasing. So when we talk about even a simple product like a phone and the smartphone of today and the phone of 1970s, they're not identical anymore. They look different, but the processes are different. That means when we talk about the production processes, research and development, design, software, after-sales services, marketing, those are service-related and also technology-intensive parts are becoming more and more important, and they capture higher value of the value added than they used to be. Manufacturing used to be more important. Now it is getting less as the technology progress. And as I already mentioned, the services component is becoming important in every sector. Not only that, the services is becoming more important globally. If you look at this graph, for example, this graph I put on the right-hand side is the share of services in the total GDP. It has been increasing. It used to be 55% in developed countries. Now it is about 75%, not only in GDP, but in international trade as well. It is becoming a much more important component driving trade. And one anecdote I would like to share with Richard Baldwin saying that maybe we are going towards a world where the merchandise trade will cease to exist and we will only have services trade. Whether that happens or not, but what we see is services becoming more and more important. And in a future's preferential schemes need to also take into account these strategic changes or important changes. And these are the global changes that we highlighted. Then the question is more or less, these are basically the question that we would like to pose in what should be the future trade preferences look like. They are not the set rules or set recommendations, but the questions for discussion. For example, is the design and operation of the current structure is good enough? That means, do we need rules of origin reform to make it more operational? Or do we need more developing countries to participate through EFQF? Or coordination? There's a coordination among these programs. And we know that it's not. In developed countries, they have their own voluntary programs, and they don't actually try to make it similar to each other. Is it a benefit of doing that? Is there anything that the basic principles that we put in terms of coordination, which also may increase the voice of the beneficiary countries? Another thing is global value chains. Are these programs actually stimulating global value chains? Is this programs has any regional focus? Having a regional focus will help them to be more effective or not, or making these programs more predictable, which is very important for global value chains to form. That means long period of time and stable tariff structure, and everyone will know that the preferences or advantages will be there for a long time, so they can form long-term business relationships. Another thing, industrial policy, for example, industrial policy now becoming more and more widespread, especially among the developed countries. Is this a kind of a threat for these programs, or is these programs can supplement the transition in developing countries? For example, renewable energy. This is a global goal, but when we ask for this transition for these developing countries, do they have capacity, industrial policy to devise for such a transition, or can these programs help developing countries to transition through maybe technology transfer, through investments, etc.? Very quickly, I will go through the other elements we already mentioned. For example, NTMs. These are domestic regulations that needs to be complied with. We cannot ask for exceptions. However, what we can ask, can we reduce the cost for the developing countries to comply with them? Can we can make them the certification cost less? Can we increase the harmonization and mutual recognition of these regulations? Or
Sorry,
services.
Masood, I need to ask you to wrap up your presentation. Thank you.
Okay, I will in 2 minutes. And services element is very important, as we discussed, that it will become a dominant component of international trade in the future. Is there anything that covers in the preferences in terms of services trade? Can we add? Can we include any incentives? For FDI, can we think of an FDI scheme that can promote out for FDI investment to these beneficiary countries? Access to technology, according to TRIPS, there's a clause saying that professional transfer of technologies is in favor of LDCs. Can we make it more operational, especially technical assistance and technology transfer mechanisms? And finally, development cooperation. Currently, we don't have any built-in development assistance programs within these schemes. Can we think something that goes along with the programs, preferential programs that supports aid for trade and trade finance? We know that trade finance has a huge gap. If I'm not mistaken, it's like $2 trillion. Can these programs actually help to alleviate that gap, close that gap? Thank you very much for your patience and listening. I would like to just wrap up my presentation here. Thank you. Bye.
Thank you. Thank you very, very much, Masood. That has been very, very informative. Now, let us invite our excellent panel. First, Mr. Melaku Desta, as already mentioned, is the coordinator of the African Trade Policy Center of the ECA. Prior to that, Mr. Desta was Principal Regional Advisor at the European Commission for Africa and the European Economic Commission for Africa, sorry about that, and was a professor at Leicester de Montfort School of Law in the United Kingdom. Next, we'd like to invite Ms. Klara Kanska, who is the trade correspondent at the European Union delegation to the African Union in Addis Ababa. She has extensive experience in international trade in European institutions, including at the DG Trade of the European Commission. Klara, thank you very much for joining us today. And last but not least, Mr. Brian Mreverwi, who is the Senior Trade Advisor at the Department of Economic Development, Trade, Tourism, Industry and Mining of the African Union Commission. Mr. Mreverwi, we are very, very happy to have you with us today. And dear participants, unfortunately, Professor David Luke cannot join us today. He informed us only this morning that he was called to undertake an urgent assignment at the university. So now, we have posed the panelists the following 3 questions. First, does the current setup of non-reciprocal trade preferences remain effective in responding to market access challenges facing developing countries in Africa? Second, how can Africa respond to the emerging calls to replace non-reciprocal trade preferences with reciprocal FTA-type arrangements while the continent is progressing towards the full implementation of the AFCFTA? The third question is, what can be a new paradigm for market access cooperation beyond tariff preferences that would better foster African countries' exports and sustainable development. Each panelist to keep their remarks within 10 minutes, please. And with this, let me first invite Mr. Melaku Desta to share his views and insights. Melaku, the floor is yours.
Miho, thank you very much for this opportunity, and I also would like to thank Masood for presenting this very rich report so succinctly and highlighting the key takeaways. And I think first, I think this is a very timely report. These are issues that within the continent here we have been looking at from different angles for a while. Of course, UNCTAD has been a leader in this area from, I think, from its very early days, as the director indicated earlier. UNCTAD has been leading this since the introduction of the GSP program, not just in 71, but prior to that, through the decisions that were taken through UNCTAD. And yes, there was a time when the non-reciprocal trade preferences, the GSP, and then more, were quite useful for many of these countries. But gradually, as the report documents very well, they have lost their effectiveness, or their utility has diminished. Again, because of the reasons that have been mentioned. I still remember a time when, a number of developing countries, especially the LDCs, struggling how to present their positions in the negotiation process, because more negotiations at the multilateral level will mean further squeeze on the preference margins naturally. And of course, the very selective and in some cases, I have to say, self-serving nature of the preferences. Even today, agriculture is still the dominant sector in which many of our countries participate, but agriculture still remains among the most protected, even for those who are supposed to benefit from these preferences. And we can go on and on along those lines, I think. But from the African angle, let me build on what Masood earlier indicated about the predictability dimension of it. AGOA since 2000 has been an important initiative from the United States, but and then as the report itself shows, AGOA indeed helped the development of particularly, the apparel industry on the continent in quite a few countries, leading to significant employment. And interestingly, we saw it even here in Ethiopia when Ethiopia was excluded from AGOA back in 2022. We looked at the numbers, and it was predominantly women who were impacted because of the exclusion of Ethiopia from the AGOA beneficiary list, because a lot of the women were working in the apparel, in the textiles apparel industry that was built up on the back of Ethiopia's access to the US markets through AGOA. That problem of predictability has always been a very big challenge. Every year, the US government would undertake eligibility determinations. And even in the best of circumstances, it would be limited to a maximum of 10 years. And now we have come to that 10-year period. And this year, in 2025, AGOA is set for renewal. Will it be renewed or will it not be? That's a big question. But there is also another big, another side to it. Even from the beginning, AGOA started from that flawed, damaging premise that there is a North or Mediterranean Africa and there is a Sub-Saharan Africa. In Africa, we don't recognize that distinction. When we have the African Continental Free Trade Area, we don't talk about a Sub-Saharan or a North African Free Trade Area. We talk about an African Continental Free Trade Area. As we try to harmonize our policies, to create that single market first in the form of a free trade area, which in its own explicit objectives, specific. If you look at the Article 3 of the FCFTA agreement, it talks about laying the foundations for a continental customs union, which means we first create the market internally, and then we come up with a common external tariff, a common external trade regime, at which point we will be able to negotiate with the rest of the world, with our partners outside Africa, acting as one. As we try to do this, the eligibility requirements from the United States, or the distinction between Sub-Saharan Africa and then Northern Africa on the other, all of these things affect Africa's own integration program. There is a similar issue that we can raise with the EU approach to Africa's Africa's its trade policy towards Africa, for example. The EU has been a leader in this area, and it was mentioned, it has been discussed in the report. The Lomé preferences that started when? In 1970, I think, right? The EU has been a pioneer in this area. They set the standard, from the Lomé 1, Lomé 2, Lomé 3, Lomé 4, then Cotonou, etc. And then this non-reciprocal preferential arrangement, again, it has been a very powerful tool. And gradually in 2000, we have the EBA, the Everything But Arms law from the EU, which targeted specifically the LDCs, and in this case, not just African LDCs, all LDCs in general. And the virtue of that law is, at least so far, there are no time limits to it. Unlike AGOA, for example, which is for 10 years, EBA does not have any time limit on it, which I think is a very important feature in terms of the predictability of the system that we're talking about. However, since the Cotonou Agreement, since the 1st of January 2008, EPAs have replaced the non-reciprocal arrangements, at least for those non-LDC African countries that were left with no choice except to sign the EPAs, even when they were not happy with them. Initially, the idea was to create bi-regional kind of EU with ECOWAS, EU with COMESA, EU with SADC kind of arrangement. That didn't work out. And then when the regional approach didn't work out, the developing countries within those regions, like ECOWAS, for example, when Nigeria, Ghana, Cote d'Ivoire, the developing countries, were negotiating with of course, together with the LDCs that are part of ECOWAS, the LDCs, by and large, did not see a rational reason. If they have EBA, they didn't see the reason why they should sign a reciprocal arrangement with the EU, while the EBA is still there as a unilateral, non-reciprocal, and a very generous preferential scheme. And then the developing countries within that region, they had to sign the APS, or otherwise they would be put on the GSP, or GSP plus, I think, in some cases. So what does that mean? What was the result? The Ghana and Cote d'Ivoire had to sign the interim EPAs, the interim economic partnership agreements, while the other LDCs stayed without the EPAs because they could afford to. And now the incompatibility between what is available to the LDCs and the non-LDCs undermines the integration program within ECOWAS, and of course you can bring it, up to the continental level. The same logic applies to Kenya in the East African Community, for example. I can go on and on like that. The UK after Brexit has effectively replicated the same thing. So what is the big point here? Yes, EBAs, as I said earlier, it's really, a very well thought, very generous program. Okay, agriculture is still suffering even under the EBA, which is why some of the cynics would say it's not everything but arms, it's also everything but agriculture, as has been said. But even then, I think EBA has a lot to go for it. But the fact that EBA is available for some and not available for the others, while the LDCs and non-LDCs are mixed, are together in a regional economic community within Africa, what is the impact of that on the integration program at the level of those regional economic communities? That has been a big issue. Going forward, we believe that yes, the EBA, expanding or extending EBA to the whole of Africa, and of course, one thing I forgot before I finish, the EU arrangement itself, just like what I said about the AGOA, is also premised on that distinction between Sub-Saharan Africa on the one hand and Mediterranean Africa on the other, for which there are the Euromed association agreements, whereas for the Sub-Saharan Africa, we have traditionally the Lomé Cotonou arrangement, and now the EPS. So going forward, first, I think, is to recognize or as to make sure that, through these non-reciprocal preferences or even the reciprocal preferences, to make sure that we do not do damage to Africa's integration program. Africa came up with the FCFTA for a reason, because Africa's economies individually, they are so small, so fragmented. We have known for a long time that each of them acting separately will not go anywhere. Integration is a necessity, not a choice for Africa. I would never question the motive behind the US or the EU in introducing these initiatives. They are meant to support Africa. You look at what the EU does through the development arm. It is something that you can only praise. You look at what the US did. I say did. I'm using the past because USAID is no longer there. But the development intention behind them, I don't think anybody would question them. It is a question of policy incoherence from within those institutions. I think those are important points that I would have to raise, especially speaking from the African angle. Africa's future is one of integration, and then we are already having challenges implementing our integration programs, our integration instruments such as the FCFTA. So as we try our best to integrate through the FCFTA, we would always, ask for help in allowing us to do what we want to do, rather than introducing inconsistent or incompatible incentives for different countries and making our regional integration even harder than it already is. That is my final point. Thank you very much, Mio.
Thank you so much, Malik. I think thank you very much for your insight and recommendation based on your rich experience in this area. You highlighted the importance of predictability of our unilateral preferences, for it to be useful for recipient countries to use it for their long-term economic diversification or structural transformation. You also pinpointed the importance of compatibility of the preferential scheme to contribute to what is going on the ground in Africa, which is the Africa AFCFTA implementation. I think these are excellent points that you raised. Thank you very much once again. And with that, I'd like to invite Ms. Clara Kanska of the EU delegation to African Union to present the views from the preference granting partner side. Now, Clara, you can take the floor, please.
Thank you very much, Miho. It's really a pleasure to be here with you. And I must say that the report is really, really timely. For the European Union, you know that we are now also in the process of a review of our GSP regime. So we are also having this kind of reflection, how to better streamline the regime, how to make it more efficient, how to make it more impactful. But I must say that I was happy to see that most of the actions that is recommended in the report, we are already implementing as the EU. So we are really going beyond the tariff measures. We are looking at behind the border measures more and more. So while unilateral schemes, I think they remain important. So the answer to the first question would be, it is still a very relevant instrument in our trade policy, especially for Africa. I would say now, yes, more and more Asian countries are actually graduating from LDC status. The EBA, everything but arms, would become really the center of gravity of our GSP regime. And if you look at the countries who benefit from the EBA, it's now mostly African countries. So we have 33 countries in Africa that benefit from the EBA scheme. Only 2 that are under the GSP. This is Congo and Nigeria, and only 1 GSP plus, which is Cabo Verde. But so you see that the center mass sort of beneficiaries is under the EBA. So we are, as Melako also mentioned, and thank you, really, Melako, for your remarks, also very pertinent. For us, it's really important that the regime is predictable. So indeed, EBA is timeless. It's forever. So it's not subject to renewals. And also the coverage is very generous. It's actually a full coverage. So really, we don't have any exemptions. It's very transparent in this sense. No, asterisks, no small print, no footnotes. It's really everything but arms. And it's also agriculture. So I don't know what drove you, Melako, to say that it's excluding agriculture. It is really including all agricultural products. Maybe I can guess that you are referring to the Green Deal legislation that might, sort of introduce new requirements and make it more difficult for developing countries to export to the EU. But I will address it in a moment. But in terms of tariff coverage, it's really full for least developed countries. If you look at the data in terms of the usage of EBA, it's quite good. So most of the countries, they oscillate between 80–90% of the preference usage rate. Of course, you have to look deeper into, by country and by product to really see, where the bottlenecks lie. But overall, it's pretty good, the usage of preferences. And also, if you look at the trends in terms of, how these exports were growing over time, it's also quite a positive trend. So you see quite a big, significant growth. I don't want to bore you with graphs. I didn't prepare any PowerPoint for today. As was advised, it was more of a discussion. But I can send you actually our graphs later on if you're interested to see, the evolution of exports under the EBA. Now, of course, if there is a disproportion between Asian EBA beneficiaries and Africans in terms of, the share of exports to the EU. So, unfortunately, still African countries are far behind. So you see countries like Bangladesh, for example, Pakistan, who are leading in terms of exports under the EBA, while African countries are behind. In terms of, within Sub-Saharan Africa, it's mostly Mozambique and Mauritania who are really big users of EBA. And then, the rest are really more at the end of the scale, unfortunately. But, there are also success stories when you look deeper. Since Melako is here, I want to have an example from Ethiopia. So if you look at cut flowers, the percentage of use of the preferences is 97 for cut flowers. So really, almost all the exporters use the EBA preferences. And also, the export figures are quite encouraging. So here, in terms of job creation, it's also quite labor intensive. There is also European investors present in Ethiopia, especially Dutch, of course. There is the tradition in the Netherlands of cultivating flowers, as you all know. So, all the technology know-how, it's been sort of brought to Ethiopia already for some years. And you see the effect in terms of numbers, really, of export and the use of preferences. So it's one of these examples that is encouraging. Another feature of the European system is the availability of data. I noticed you mentioned it in the report, that it would be good to have, this kind of granular data to see, where the problems are. So actually, we publish Excel sheets where you can go by country and by product to see to what extent it uses the preferences. I encourage you to see this because it's really interesting. And there you can see, okay, some products, they don't use the preferences. Maybe it's only, I don't know, 40%. Why? You know, and then you can really dig deeper. And here I think that we can, in our cooperation projects, you know, we can really use this data to see, you know, where we can still work with the beneficiary countries to improve the export performance. So that's very useful. Also for the governments of the beneficiary countries, you know, to focus on these sectors and to, you know, see why the preference use is still not enough. And now in terms of these new avenues of cooperation, so where we can take these schemes, you know, further. So now we are actually proposing different kind of partnerships or cooperation schemes in different value chains or different areas. Critical raw materials is one example where we partner with certain countries also in Africa in order to, you know, sort of design this kind of win-win partnerships where Europe will bring investors, will bring the technology and know-how. And on the other hand, it will get this kind of resilient supply chains to diversify the supplies of critical raw materials. So the idea is, you know, that we'll develop local value addition, beneficiation of raw materials to cover also European demand. So partially, you know, it will go to cover the European demand, but also the African countries' demand. So that's why I say it's a win-win partnership. We are also thinking of this kind of new generation agreements that are called CTIPs. Maybe you haven't heard of this yet. It's really, really new. So it's clean trade and investment partnerships. It's mentioned in the new commission guidelines. So, you know, we have a new commission also. So with the new commission also come new ideas. So the CTIP is one of them. And for the moment, it's been announced already that South Africa is flagged as the first African country for CTIP. So we'll see, you know, it's very, very initial now, you know, just scoping, but this kind of partnership will cover all the green value chains. So, you know, it's not just critical raw materials like in these MOUs on CRMs, this is more broader. So this would be energy transition, green hydrogen, you know, renewable energies. So the idea is also to work on these value chains together to attract European investment, but also work on the regulatory framework. Because of course, you know, the investment climate, business climate is very, very important. And investment is, you know, goes hand in hand with exports, you know, the use of preferences. All of this is actually connected. So you also noted in the report that investment is very important. We are also working on sustainable investment facilitation agreements in Africa. So that's another tool in our toolbox. Now we concluded one with Angola. It's been working successfully. We had our first meeting of the committee, and we are thinking of Ghana and other Western African countries as the next candidates. And at the same time, you know that at WTO, there is the Investment for Development initiative. So we encouraged our partners to also, you know, bring it into the framework of the WTO. And also, you know, we have development cooperation projects, as Melaku mentioned, both at continental level. So we really focus on supporting integration under AFCFTA, but also at REX level, so regional and member states level. And now more and more we focus on, you know, how to fully implement AFCFTA. So even if we work with member states, we also work with them, you know, to sort of translate the commitments into the national framework, because we also think, you know, it's very important for the capacity of African countries to export and attract investment, you know, to create the economies of scale. So that's why, you know, our programs are increasingly focused on integration. Just to tell you, the new program that is not yet launched actually, but it will be launched very soon. So I can already tell you it's 25 million for the continental component. It's Africa Trade Competitiveness and Market Access Project. It's something, yeah, it's very comprehensive. So it has these elements that you mentioned. So it has quality infrastructure cooperation. So we are going to work with the African Quality Institute, you know, with European quality institutes. You know, it's really something, you know, that goes to the core of this problem. There is the, you know, problem of a capacity to export quality products, but, you know, would comply with all the requirements in Europe. So conformity assessment, etc. So this is part of the program, and also working on value chains. Because indeed, you know, nowadays, this is the key, you know, to integrate into regional, global value chains. So this is going to be another leg of this project. And it will have also regional components. So I mentioned the continental component of 25 million, but also there will be regional components at the REC level of the same project, to bring synergies. And I know I don't have much time left, but I wanted to, last but not least, address what Melako was mentioning on the economic partnership agreements and in general FTAs, sort of FTAs versus EBAs or GSP, how we see it. So, it's also goes back to the time when we had the WTO issue. We all know that our waiver for the ACP arrangement was not extended anymore. So we really had to think how to make our preferences compatible with the WTO framework, not to discriminate. So this is the origin, to say, of the EPAs. So you always have to trade off a bit between the depth of the preferences. So if you would extend the preferences to all African countries, then of course it would be more shallow. Then we wouldn't be able to propose the EBA to everybody. So then it would be more like AGOA style. So of course, LDCs would not be able to have the full duty-free, quota-free treatment. So it's always a trade-off. So we thought, let's take as a criterion the level of development. So for these developed countries, we will keep the EBAs and no pressure to enter into EPAs in a way, because the EBAs are, as we said, timeless. So there's no question of removing these preferences. So if a given country wants to join the EPA, it can join the EPA, but if it wants to keep the EBA preferences, it can keep the EBA preferences. And actually some countries do both, which is interesting. So we have Mozambique, for example, which is both an EBA beneficiary, but it's also a member of the SADC EPA, so Economic Partnership Agreement, and it can still continue to use both. So we are really flexible. So now for certain traders, it might be more advantages to continue using the everything but arms to export from Mozambique. They can use it. And if they want to use the EPA preferences, they can use the EPA preferences. So they are actually doing both. But some other LDCs decided not to join the regional EPA, as Melako mentioned. And of course, it's not the best scenario for regional integration. We agree. But that's why, the membership is open for all the members of the different RECs to join. So for example, if Kenya is leading the way, nothing prevents other countries to join, like Rwanda, for example, or others, Tanzania or Uganda in the same block. The same for ECOWAS. So we keep it, sort of open for membership. And we think also that reciprocal trade arrangements have this advantage that they are really stable. So they are not subject to be revisions, reforms as the unilateral preference scheme. So they provide more certainty for businesses. And again, if you look at the figures, we noticed that along the years, the countries that have an EPA were actually doing better in terms of exports when the countries were just sticking to the unilateral trade preferences. And the difference is quite striking. It's really, we are talking about big differences between the EPA countries and non-EPA countries in Africa. And also attracts more investment because, this reciprocal trade arrangements are very, very stable. So we are not going to be subject to conditionalities. While, now in the review of the GSP regime, we might introduce new conditions related to environmental convention, for example, Paris Agreement. Maybe not all the countries, will like that. So that's why, it's different. If you're already in a trade agreement, it's very, and it's not going to change. It's very difficult to change a trade agreement, I can tell you. We are now in the process of a deepening of the EPA with ESA countries, Eastern and Southern Africa, and it's really, I think it's already the 15th negotiating round. So, it's really quite, it's something that is quite stable and not that amenable to changes, I can tell you. So this is, I think it's a big advantage. And of course, also sustainability criteria are very important for us. So in the EPAs, you have a whole chapter on sustainable development, especially the modern ones, like with Kenya, which we think is also very important nowadays, bringing me to the end, which is the Green Deal, which indeed, brings with itself a lot of new requirements, but also opportunities, I think. And, it's a whole new chapter, so I don't think we have time to enter into this. But we have very successful example already with West Africa, with kind of a very novel approach to the Green Deal legislation, and how to work together on implementing it, which is called the Cocoa Talks. I don't know if you've heard about it, but it's like a multi-stakeholder dialogue that was set up some years ago with the 3 Western African countries that export cocoa to the EU. And under this scheme, there was a declaration adopted at the end, kind of sustainability principles that were agreed to between the industry stakeholders, the EU, and the governments of the West African countries. And actually, when the deforestation regulation was postponed for 1 year, the 3 countries that were collaborating in this initiative were not happy, because we were saying, we are ready, thanks to this stakeholders engagement and this declaration we all signed, this sort of roadmap. We are more than ready, and we want to start now already under the deforestation regulation. So why are you postponing this? So you see, it's a very interesting example of, what we can do beyond, mere preferences. Now, if we really engage in different value chains and really, target specific value chains, how it can really work successfully. So ending on this positive note, thank you so much for your attention.
Thank you, Clara, for comprehensive information on everything but arms, economic partnership agreements, but also this EU's new initiatives, and also the intention to review the GSP and some ideas, particularly on this Africa Trade Competitiveness Market Access Program, if it's the title or not. You said it hasn't been implemented yet, but if you have some, like a web link or the site that is already available and some extra information that you want to share to the participants here, maybe you can just, share the link using the chat, and that would be very good, and we would be most interested to learn this new initiative. Also, I see that, we have already received quite many questions. I don't know if we have time to go through everything. So dear panelists, I invite you to go through the questions. At the end, I would ask you to maybe address 1 or 2 questions that you think most relevant. But with that, I'd like to invite now Mr. Brian Mureveri, who is the Senior Trade Advisor at African Union Commission. Brian, we have had quite a lot of, different, but also sometimes echoing the same note of the importance and the need to move away forward of the trade preferences. But could you share your view then from AFCFTA point of view? Brian, you can take the floor, please.
Thank you, Michal, and good afternoon, colleagues. And I would like to take this moment to thank UN Trade and Development together with UNECA for organizing this webinar. It's coming at a very timely moment when the global trading system is very fluid, actually more fluid than I anticipated, especially in the last 6 weeks. Yes, first of all, I would want to say the GSP design, the design itself is very, very noble and very, very important. And as African countries, we really appreciate that provision in terms of championing our developmental needs as well as promoting exports. However, I must say from the onset that African countries really do not have a challenge in terms of market access under GSP. But the problem really are internal in terms of productive capabilities, trade-related infrastructure, access to trade finance, ability to move up the value chain and where to plug in as a country, as well as the basic trade promotion activities. It is very unsettling to note that in some cases you approach exporters, or even if you do a continental survey in terms of awareness of these GSPs, you realize that very few corporates are aware of these preferences. In fact, more important, recently ITC carried out an exercise in terms of awareness of the AFCFTA and realized that over 54% of the large-scale corporates in Africa are not aware of the AFCFTA, and this is very worrisome. Now, moving forward in the interest of time, I've realized that in terms of the design per se, it's really not a problem. GSP are perfect. However, we might want to rethink the export strategies under GSP in terms of, does this offer really available for utilization? For example, I will cite an example of AGOA. We have so many countries, about 32 of them, that benefit under AGOA. But if you look at the utilization of preferences, it is so low, especially outside non-oil exports and textiles. The rest of the product, the utilization is far below 5%. So this is very worrisome. So then you want to say, why is this so? Many of these countries face challenges in terms of compliance to rules of origin and non-tariff measures, especially SPS. So these are things in terms of how it then affects the whole utilization of the GSP and how it benefits the exporting countries. But we have a new baby in the house in the name of the AFCFTA. AFCFTA is a big continental market comprising of 54 countries, 1.4 billion people, 3.4 in terms of GDP, $1 trillion. And we are saying, if you think of this as a big continental market, how then do we plan in terms of the utilization of the GSP? My initial reaction would be then to allow for accumulation like across the continent. And then, for example, I'll give an example of uranium from the Congo, beneficiation on site, and final product in South Africa for export into the developed countries. So this is basically how then countries can then move up the value chain in terms of utilization of the GSP preferences. But by and large, I think the AFCFTA can be leveraged upon in terms of the utilization of the GSP. It is here, and we have so far we have over 48 countries that have ratified. And recently we did a test run in terms of the AFCFTA Guided Trade Initiative, and we realized that out of the 38 countries that were on board, the systems are ready in terms of the customs procedures, IT systems, the capacity buildings of the customs officials, and the export readiness of the member states. And also, thanks to UNECA for coming up with AFCFTA national implementation strategies. And also, I think this also the same can also be applied to encourage countries that benefit under GSP to come up with export strategies under GSP. Without that, you don't have a guiding document that sort of like assists you in moving this process forward. Thank you, Mio. I yield the floor.
Thank you very much, Brian. This is it was very, very sort of extremely innovative idea, I would say, about, for example, like accumulation of origin in a sense vis-a-vis GSP, covering all the countries that are implementing AFCFTA. That would for sure, that would improve the compatibility between AFCFTA and CFTA and GSP, and also the importance of export strategies. Now we have about 12 minutes remaining, and we have several questions. I note that some of the questions were addressed to UNCTAD, so I'd like to suggest that we are going to make a short report of this session, and the answers from UNCTAD can be included in that note, so that can respond to everyone who might be interested more about UNCTAD's work or UNCTAD trade preferences outlook. Now, may I then invite panelists, if you had a time to go through some of the questions who are in the QA box and respond to some of the questions that you see. May I start with Meraku, probably? Please, Meraku, you have, like, each person might have, let's say, 5 minutes. Thank you very much.
Yes, thank you very much, Miho, and let me also thank the fellow panelists for excellent engagement on the issues. There was one question that I jotted down from Clara directly, why I described EBA and HQA as everything but agriculture, not just everything but arms. And the reason, Clara, we came up with that is after we did some research about the actual data on agriculture, agricultural exports from the LDCs to the EU, and the impact, the impact on agricultural trade has been diminished because of the well-known, if not notorious, standard system that the EU has, which are always changing, space standard, because agriculture by and large is about food products. Yes, there are cut flowers and industrial crops, etc. But the moment you come down to the food products, you can't look at the regime that applies to livestock exports and meat products, etc. The EU, it is an impossible thing almost to think about. There is, I think, only one country that exports to the EU when it comes to beef, for example, one or two countries, etc. So from the questions online, Miho, think there is one that relates to decoupling, which says something like, decoupling is back on in vogue right now. So how does this affect the conversation? I think is what the question is about. Yes, it is true, but one would hope that things will stabilize over time. I am certainly a believer that the multilateral trading system cannot just be wished away or die because of what's going on right now. As an African trade policy scholar in my academic life, I have argued against the WTO's position on trade, on development issues, using agriculture as my starting point. But even a bad WTO, a weak WTO, a non-development friendly WTO is better than a no WTO for Africa. So I think Africa has a great stake, and I believe we will bring back, we'll keep and rebuild the multilateral trading system for our sake, for the world's sake. I believe that's how I look at it. This is probably a personal view on this one. The use of standards as disguised trade measures has been mentioned, which they're not always disguised. They have legitimate reasons for their existence. But in some cases, they can be stretched so much that one can question their motive, whether they're driven by genuine health and safety considerations, or if it's the agriculture lobby, the food lobby that's behind them. These are always questions that we had. I think we know the kind of debate that's going on around here. Somebody has asked for us to use slides for this kind of interventions. I think that's a good point. I am often, I prefer this kind of engagements on the spot, but I understand from the perspective of a participant what is useful, and these are things that certainly I'll take into account as I go on. Otherwise, most of the issues, Miho, as you mentioned, are directed at UNCTAD, and I also encourage Masoud's presentation to be shared. I think it was very, very useful. And if there are any specific questions, I will be very happy to come back if we have time. Otherwise, let me just say thank you and stop here. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Thank you so much, Malik. Clara, would you like to respond to some of the questions?
Yes, actually, Miho, I already did respond on the chat to some of them. For example, to send links, to the data that we publish on the usage of preferences. I also sent in the general chat the link to the new project that we have with ITC and UNIDO. So you're welcome to consult it. And I think it's, I would definitely agree with Malak on WTO. I mean, that we are really a staunch supporter as the EU of the multilateral trading system. It's really in our DNA. So we really hope that it's going to persist. And also on standards, even for our agricultural lobby, it's very difficult to cope with them. So I must tell you, it's not only outwards, it's also inwards. But the climate change goals and the whole Green Deal is not really easy for our farmers to implement. You saw what was happening, in Brussels and other countries, EU countries. We had tractors on the street, etc. So it's also difficult even for us to implement all of these ambitious climate goals. But we are set to keep on course. So this was really important in the new Commission, in the guidelines, that the Green Deal is there to stay. So it's not like it's going to be weakened. But of course, it's not easy to decarbonize, to sort of go away from this kind of coal-based economies. Even for us, I come from a coal-based country, Poland. So even for us, it's also very difficult, and we are still on the way. So yeah, but we have different instruments to support our businesses and businesses in developing countries to cope with these new climate objectives, which is a shared concern. I already mentioned the deforestation regulation, but we are also working on, for example, with South Africa on the Just Energy Transition Partnership, which is helping South Africa to decarbonize and also coping with CBAM, which is another measure that I'm sure you all know. So it's something that we partner with African countries as well, and that's the idea of these new partnerships that I mentioned, of the CTIP, and the others.
Excellent. Thank you very much, Clara, and thank you very much for sharing the link on the chat. Now, Brian, I don't know if you had a chance to go through the question, and I'd like to invite you to respond to some of them. Brian, please.
Thank you, Miho. I have one question in the chat which is related to AGOA and its future. Yes, indeed, AGOA came into effect in 2000 after President Bill Clinton signed it. As you know, AGOA is a unilateral trade agreement. It offers Africa about duty-free, quota-free access to 1,600 product lines, and in addition to the 5,000 that are already under GSP. But we are also concerned that AGOA is coming to expiry in September 2025. That's a few months down the line. However, the African Union Commission, in collaboration with the ECA, Afrexim Bank, AFDB, the African Union Commission mission in Washington, and the African diplomatic community have been actively engaging the U.S. administration, the former U.S. administration, to ensure that AGOA is extended by an additional 10 to 20 years in order to ensure certainty and, of course, stronger business relations between the U.S. and Africa. And we'll continue to do so with the new administration that is in place. I know at this moment, renewal of AGOA is not a priority to them. They are more concerned with other issues. And certainly, when the time comes, we will also engage them to ensure that we revive this partnership that has benefited Africa in terms of job creation, as well as sustainable development and in Africa. I yield the floor. Thank you.
Thank you. Thank you very much, Brian. With this, we are coming to close the session. I'd like to thank you very much, to all the distinguished panelists and also the participants for great questions. As I said, there will be a note or some kind of very quick summary of this discussion. Sorry, I see the hand, Meraku. Sorry about that. I just give you a floor first.
Miho, thank you. I raised my hand because I saw a specific question that was directed to me. If you have 1 minute, if you give me 1 minute, I will be very happy to go back to go to it. So Anthony Bisong is asking, the FCFTA became operational in 2021, but right now MSMEs are not taking advantage of it. What do we need to do to ensure that they take advantage, and what is the state of the FCFTA at the moment is the question. I am going to put a link to a document that we recently, a very accessible document that we recently published, and I will make it available here so that colleagues can look at it. But the short answer is, I think Brian, thank you for making reference to that survey earlier. Brian said it earlier, the FCFTA is a big initiative on the continent, but bringing information down to the ground and making it accessible to the stakeholders, particularly the MSMEs, is a really, really huge task. We are doing everything we can. We can do more. There is a lot that we are doing right now, but clearly that's not enough. And I think the call that I would have is, I heard Clara earlier talking about the new initiative for 25 million euros, which is most welcome. I call on everybody really here, not just UNCTAD, EU, AUC, etc. All of us as citizens of the continent as well, I think, that we really have to make a huge effort, a concerted effort to make the FCFTA, information about accessible. That's what we try to do. And I will put a link here, as I mentioned, but let me stop here, Miho, because I know you are wanting to close. Thank you. Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Thank you very much, Maraku. This was extremely important information. I was saying that the summary of this session and also all this information that was shared by you and Clara and others, and also the presentation itself, and the session is recorded. So the link to the session would be provided on the same page as we use, or same page as registration page. So in a week time, if you go back to the registration page, we will make sure that these information are available to you. With that, I really, once again, I want to thank you, all the speakers and the participants, and my team, Mesut, and also Taisuke, Ebru, Federico, and Cecilia, who have made this session come true. And I just want to inform you also that we are now preparing Trade Preferences Outlook 2025. And this new version is going to look at exactly the linkage between preferences and foreign direct investment. The foreign direct investment provider strategy and also the, sort of the host country's strategy. And we'd like to keep a very close connection with you. I'm sure that you have plenty ideas and experience to share. And also the participants, if you have your views on trade preferences and investment, we really invite you to provide us with your views and thoughts. With that, once again, thank you very much indeed. And with this, I close this session. Thank you. Bye-bye.
Thank you very much. Thank you.
Thank you.
Thank you, Miho. Thank you,
Bye.
colleagues. Bye-bye.
Thank you. Bye.